Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you here. Thank you for coming out on a is it Wednesday today or is it Thursday? I'm losing. It's Wednesday, isn't it? It's been one of those weeks, I'm afraid. But it's great to have you here at the Wilson Center. The Mexico Institute is delighted to host our friend. We're old friends since this morning. We had breakfast together. And so Jesús Seade, who is the chief negotiator for the NAFTA renegotiation process for Mexican President-elect Andrés Manuel López Obrador administration. Jesús has a very distinguished career, as you can see from the bio that's on the sheet of paper in front of you. Before he became known as Andrés Manuel's NAFTA guy, Jesús was vice president of 2 leading universities in Hong Kong and China, a member of the advisory board of the Ministers of Trade and Financial Services in Hong Kong. He's a former ambassador to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, and has been a senior advisor to the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. He has a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering, which must have come in very, very handy at certain points during the negotiations, I would imagine. I think maybe alchemy would have been a better degree.
If I may interrupt, in common with President Xi of China, Garry Kasparov, and then halfway, because she quit, not in the first year, but in the third or fourth, Cindy Crawford.
Ah, that's potentially the most interesting one. Yes, well done. And a Ph.D. in economics from the University of Oxford. Jesús, it's wonderful to have you here. We have all been enthralled, fascinated by the negotiation process over the past 13 to 14 months. The final agreement, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, which will be named something different in Mexico. No. We're waiting to see what the people of Mexico decide on that, because there is a little consulta popular on that going on over Twitter. The president-elect has decided to ask the people because the people are wise. But that agreement is holding us fascinated here in Washington, because we are looking at every single page, and that takes a long time. There are people in the room, such as my colleague Laura Dawson, the director of the Canada Institute, who carries copies of the agreement around with her. It's a good self-defense mechanism, isn't it, with 1,200 pages or so. But we're still analyzing it. But overall, I think that the message that has come out here in Washington is that it's not a perfect agreement. And nobody ever really expected it to be a perfect agreement. But it's a good agreement. And it's the agreement that we have, and we'd like to see it ratified as soon as possible. So, Jesús, I'd like you to give us your thoughts on both the process that you participated in the negotiation, the agreement itself, and if I might, and we can do this in the Q&A if you like, but where do we go from here in terms of Mexican trading relations with North America and with the world? Thank you very much for being here.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Duncan. It's a great privilege to be here in such a distinguished house. I've always admired it, and I appreciate very much the presence of Ambassador Hills, with whom I shared a panel, a floor, not long ago. I apologize in advance if something that I say, you've already heard it, but that at least gives you the ability to respond and to rebut me more effectively than if it just comes out of the blue and you say, what is he saying? Now you know what I'm saying. and I thank all of you. I thank my good friend Alfredo Cuevas, old colleague of mine, close friend of mine, and everybody. I'm very appreciative for your presence here. Well, you spoke of process, contents, and prospects. So let me take up first the process. I didn't know López Obrador personally at all. Unlike most of my professional colleagues and friends, I did not find him to be the danger for Mexico that he has been made out to be the last 20 years. I've always been slightly nervous of some aspects, but I think that most of it has been the result of awful antagonism brought up by conservative forces. And the two things that I liked about him are, well, two priorities he sets that I am convinced must be priorities for my country. You have to address those well beyond any discussion on how you run this or that area of policy. And this is his concern. I'm convinced it's a very honest, sincere, deep concern for the awful inequality that has developed. The same is true almost everywhere. We've had the 1% in Manhattan and all that. But believe me, in Mexico, it's worse. It has been probably exacerbated by income concentration policies, on competition policy or fiscal, all kinds of things. And the result is that there's no longer a middle class. So that has to be attended to. And maybe that, the fact that you have a whole mass of people with a bleak future in front of them, probably feeds into all the other things we have that are more serious in an immediate sense, such as violence and all that. So his priority on that, and relatedly, I think, his priority on corruption in particular, and in a broader sense, law and order. Probably corruption lies at the heart of much of the law and order issues we have, because we have developed all kinds of inadequate governance issues and so on over time. So those are his two main priorities, and if that's the case, combined with the incredible ability he has to attract people and to attract support, you say, well, yeah, the number one problem of the country is none of those. It's the violence and the drug problem and all that. But to have a remote chance of handling that, you must deal with the awful income concentration gap. You must deal with law and order, and you have to have an amazing appeal, public appeal. And he has that. Mm-hmm. How do I know that he has that? Well, for the last 20 years, he has been at the receiving end of incredible attacks, campaigns, constantly, from a number of billionaires, and not everybody, of course. He's worked very well with business class, but some, and the governments, and all those attacks only increase his appeal until he came through. So I think that he could make a change for the good. I'm not going to bet my hand that he will, but I certainly would bet some money. So I'm optimistic. I didn't know the man, but some friends were kind enough to recommend me, and he invited me. And so I joined. Some friends, when this was announced, wrote to me saying, "Hey, Chucho," which is my nickname in Mexico, is he serious? Did you think about it? That's the way they received my appointment. And I said, yeah, I thought about it, come on. And I'm very pleased. I think things are going a little bit mixed. There are some things that I don't like a lot, like his approach to public service, cutting salaries and so on, wielding an axe this way, instead of wielding it this way and saying, this is bad. This is the way to do it. Anyway, so there are things that probably will have to be addressed, improved, but essentially he's, I think, doing the right things. I've had the opportunity to meet with him many times because of this negotiation, at least 20 meetings or so, half of them or more one-on-one or two-on-one. And I'm amazed by the sincerity, honesty, drive of the man. So that's background. Now, we came to this negotiation a bit fortuitous. Nobody controls the political cycle in the US and in Mexico. Sometimes they coincide. This time it was 2 years ahead in the US. President Trump came in, and immediately we began to have all the talk about pulling out of NAFTA, the worst treaty ever, which of course Ambassador Hills will agree with. And so essentially this negotiation started then, okay? I don't know when, 8 months later, they began to actually engage negotiations. You could have expected this to finish within maybe 6 months or something, but they began to drag on and to be stemmed by the prospect of the elections coming, to be kind of slowed and distracted. So they couldn't finish. And increasingly, the two things began to get mixed. And so the negotiations just didn't finish. We were suspended back in May, I think, with elections coming on 1st July, a landslide for López Obrador. He takes the two houses and the presidency with the biggest majority probably ever, because anything before was not very democratic. So a lot of kind of a strong mandate for him to do things. So President Peña Nieto and his team very nicely and honestly opened the door for us, for him to come and join forces. And so he appointed me his negotiator for this negotiation. His negotiator, but observer. So the mandate that I received was to join the process. He took a very clean, very nice stance, saying, I support this process. I want a good relationship with the US. I want a good NAFTA 2, or whatever it would be called. I want a good one. And also, I don't want to come into my term to have to negotiate it, because I want to do so many other things. So I support this being done by Peña Nieto, completed. So my mandate was support the process. Don't create problems. So if there's any issue where you don't quite agree, it has to be very serious concern before you open the issue, before you create a problem. You will intervene only where you can help, not to hinder, not to create a problem, to say, hey, this element on textiles is not good, I don't like it, or this or that. No, only to help. Except for energy, which is politically a super top priority area for him, where he said clearly to me, I don't want to change the Constitution, I don't want to change the law, a law that I voted against, or I was against, and all my movement, my friends in the legislature were against when the law was changed, the law, hydrocarbons law 4 years ago. We were against, but we're not going to change it. But I'm not going to endorse an agreement that directly quotes from that. So let's see how you handle it. So my mandate was a bit complicated, but basically that. Energy, and then the rest to support. We went into it, and indeed, energy was an area. Well, I mean, after a couple of weeks in that process, the negotiations restarting in the middle of July, I came to him to say, well, this is the spectrum of results in the top 8 or 10 areas, the most important areas. I said, this is what came out here, already closed, and these are not closed, but this is what may come out. This is what I think. And in that very long meeting with him and some close associates, he just gave me a carte blanche, saying, everything that you tell me you support or you are comfortable with, I trust you. Everything that is yet to be settled, I trust you to intervene in the right direction, that's fine. But in energy, don't tell me that nothing is being added, that it's okay. No, I don't like it. Why? Because it was a cut and paste, a copy and paste exercise from the law of hydrocarbons. Here, let me just comment for those of you who have not been trade negotiators. In my reading, every free trade agreement consists of two parts. One is one sentence that says, hereby we create free trade. And the other is 1,000 pages explaining why not quite. All the blocks and exceptions and limitations to free trade. Okay? So you have free trade. And in the absence of qualifications, you have free trade in plastic pockets and leather shoes and hydrocarbons. Everything's free trade, unless you place the limitations. The limitations, in the case of hydrocarbons, came from the law of hydrocarbons. So every quotation from there was good for him, because it was a limitation on what otherwise would be free trade. So we are not Singapore. So you have limitations like hydrocarbon exports are subject to export permits. Companies set up Mexico may impose a number of people on the boards of Mexican nationality. Investment can be subject to having a certain amount of local content, all those kinds of things. And that added to about 25 pages in different chapters on investment, on services, on state companies, 25 pages. So when I presented to him the results, I put to him all those pages and said, but all these are defenses, all these are things that you should like. No, I don't like them, because it's a quotation from the law. If this is approved, it's just symbolic, this is political. And I stress, I'm not changing anything, that's fine, but this is not good. So we had to have an awful week of exploration of alternatives and how to say it. It was what I called my darkest week, without any doubt. A couple of days I woke up in the morning shaking, straight from sleep to shaking, feeling that the country was falling apart. It was my fault. My fault because I'm not finding a way to bring things together. But in the end, we found a resolution which is a very elegant, brief, super brief treatment of energy. 2 paragraphs, you know what they are? 2 paragraphs. One of them is a sovereignty restatement. That was already there. There was a sentence. But we made it very clear and blunt to satisfy any kind of political uncertainty or question. That says the 3 countries here have a sovereign right over their political processes, over their legal instruments and constitution and derived laws and the ability to change these. And in the case of Mexico, it has sovereign ownership over its national resources and all that. So that's 1 paragraph. And the other paragraph is the one that replaces those 25 pages of non-conforming measures, that's how we call them, all those limitations about national content or Mexicans on the board. They're non-conforming measures. And all those 25 pages were replaced by 1 paragraph, 3-4 lines that say, actually in all sectors, it doesn't say which sector, although the intention is energy, but we don't have limitations in other sectors in that regard. But just to explain it, let's say in the energy sector, the 3 countries grant each other the same access and other conditions of treatment that they grant to 3rd countries in the context of other international agreements they have ratified. And by saying ratified, the TPP that you are familiar with came in because Mexico has ratified that, the TPP 11, the reduced TPP. So that's energy, and that left the US after incredible haggling, but fully satisfied. And I assure you that Ambassador Hill's successor, Bob Lighthizer, is very demanding. He's really a tough guy to deal with. But after a week of extreme haggling and discussion and agitated scenes, he was very pleased and completely on board, and so was López Obrador. So that was the end of that, and that's what we got on that. So beyond that, it was a question of supporting and so on. I was very pleased to be able to create an amazing bond, not just bond in a personal sense, but effective, harmonious working relationship with the Chief Negotiator, the Secretary of Economy, Ildefonso Guajardo, and with the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, our Foreign Secretary, Luis Videgaray. They were there all the time, more than the press would realize, always. And so was I. So it became a team of 3 against a team of 1. You expect that having 3 to decide on issues and stances against 1 places the 3 in a condition of weakness, because the 1 has all the threads in his hand, all the ability to decide, to think, whatever, whereas the 3 have to second guess each other, negotiate, maybe consult different parties. So you expect that this kind of division of the Mexican side between an incoming government and the outgoing government and different ministries looking after each other's shoulder, all that would be a source of weakness. But in fact, I'm very proud to say that we turned that into a tremendous strength, because we worked completely harmoniously, very good mutual support, without losing the value that having different godfathers behind you might give you. Okay, so in some regards, oh no, AMLO will not accept this or whatever, that can be helpful. And we're not, we are one. So we turned that into a strength, and we worked extremely well. And that has reassured not just markets, but ourselves, that we have a fully smooth transition of power in the area of trade and the NAFTA, USMCA now. So that was a very fortunate thing. Now, having said that, let me just give you my views on two major aspects of the agreement that I would like to put to you, and then we can discuss. One is that if you look at it superficially, particularly if you're an economist that have certain concerns about efficiency and so on, the treaty seems to be a step in the wrong direction, in the sense that it is somewhat protectionist. Okay? It closes the outer border a little bit in basically across manufacturers, okay, by making rules of origin tighter. What does that mean? Well, for those of you who are not trade negotiators, to have free trade, you have to have a rule of origin, okay? If this comes from Mexico, you can import it free of tax. And if it comes from China, it pays a tax. And what if it comes from China to Mexico, and just take it and take it to the United States? Well, you cannot accept it as being Mexican just because it came from Mexico. So you have to say at least something like 50% of the cost has to be from Mexico. Or in the case of this one, the water has to come from Mexico. The bottle, I don't care. You can have different kinds of rules. And in general, the rules of origin across industrial sectors become more demanding. So it's more difficult to import things into Mexico to then finish the product and bring it to the United States. And by doing that, you are basically stemming imports from the rest of the world, making them less useful or reducing the scope for them to some extent. So being more protectionist, that should be a bad thing, right? Well, I am convinced that's not the case for Mexico, and I probably would accept that it may not be the case, not even for the United States, for the following reasons. From the point of view of the United States, imagine that this region is the United States, which in economic terms is an approximation. It's by far the biggest economy. The concept that protectionism is bad, which I completely espouse, relates essentially to the fact that if you protect your economy, you can buy things from somebody else that are more inefficient, more costly to make, instead of importing them from good old France or Brazil or somewhere that may be more efficient producers. So that's basically the point. Right? You are replacing efficient purchase outside by inefficient production inside. But that's a very static view of the world. Here we have the biggest economy in the world, and a fast-growing economy is doing very well, whether you like it or not. I don't know what your politics may be, but what President Trump has done has got the economy growing, not necessarily for the next 25 years, but certainly for now, it's growing very well. And in that situation, the fact that this protectionism has increased will not necessarily reduce trade. The main effect will be that those countries outside that want to sell into the United States and now find it more difficult to sell into the United States will continue to say, hey, I want to sell into the United States. It's the biggest economy, it's growing. So I will increase my investment. I will bring investment, which is what President Trump wanted. He wanted to force investment in, and it may well work. And I'm not sure that this reduces any sense of efficiency for the United States. That's United States. In terms of Mexico, it's even more clearly potentially beneficial. And I am in a minority of almost one saying this in Mexico, because even people in the negotiating team say, oh, rules of origin became tougher. That was a bit of a loss, but we have gains elsewhere. And I say, no, this creates opportunities for Mexico because in two ways. Again, you have this region called USMCA region, North America. You have North America. The walls around North America rise a little bit. Now, Mexico, as the cost-effective emerging market economy in that group, next to the big economy called United States, has a competitive advantage created artificially by this situation compared to Germany or Korea or China or Brazil. Okay, some edge for our producers to sell. So commercially, there's a benefit. And more importantly, again, what I said before, all those countries will want to jump the wall that increased and invest in the region. It's the purpose. So probably investment may increase in Canada, why not? In the United States, why not? But certainly Mexico has the potential to be particularly good at attracting this increased investment by Toyota or BMW or by producers of chemicals or flat glass, okay? So I think there is a scope for benefits both on the investment front and the commercial front for Mexico in particular, and also for the United States and Canada. Secondly, the second area that I want to mention as being a distinctive feature of this, let me put it again a bit historically. I believe that the NAFTA, the treaty that we created 24 years ago, was an amazing path opener for the world. Continues to be the most important international trade agreement anywhere if you ignore the European Union, which is not a trade agreement. It's an agreement between many countries, but it's a political union, it's many other things. Apart from that, it is the most important trade agreement created 24 years ago that was really hugely influential on the way countries related to each other on trade around the world. So many trade agreements in South America or between the US and other countries outside or in other parts of the world dealt with each other, okay? It was the first big agreement that was really based on cooperative, respectful, but business relationship between the countries with clear rules. As you relate companies among them, you were relating countries between them or among them, being three. So a strong rules-based agreement, unlike the political blah blah that was so prevalent before, creating things that were not particularly used to anybody. For example, maybe Ambassador Hills can clarify this one, but I have not done kind of research to check, but in the same year, 1993, when this was being negotiated, when the NAFTA introduced ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement, so a company being able to sue the host government where it has invested because of some grievance. This ISDS was one. There were one or two other agreements around the world that also introduced. So I'm not sure if NAFTA was the first one. Maybe it was the first one, but it certainly was the first big one. Okay, I know that, for example, a little investment treaty between Hong Kong and Australia, not a free trade agreement, investment treaty between Hong Kong and Australia, signed in 1993, has ISDS. So I'm not sure which was first, but NAFTA was in the first cohort of agreements introducing ISDS that now has been introduced by now in 3,000 agreements around the world, of which maximum 200 or so, probably even less than that, are free trade agreements. So most of it is other kinds of agreements, investment treaties or double taxation treaties, whatever, where they introduce ISDS. So NAFTA was extremely influential. Well, I believe that this agreement is very likely to be just as influential for the next 20, 30, 40 years. Why? Well, it is again a major overhauling of establishing rules, tough rules, clear rules between countries for their engagement. But in addition, it has something that probably happened almost accidentally. Each item that I'm going to mention to you in a moment came in for different reasons, but they add to what I call a social agenda. We have at least 5 areas of the new agreement that are completely unusual for trade agreements anywhere, certainly alien to the NAFTA, and expanding what the NAFTA has, but also probably not reflected in trade agreements anywhere. These are labor and environment, which NAFTA did have as side agreements outside the NAFTA, but side agreements are not treaty, they are love letters, good intentions, but without the ability to use disputes resolution mechanisms to enforce obligations. They're not obligations. Now we have 2, and they are not kind of the old mentality of one country enforcing or forcing disciplines on another country. Not at all. I can tell you that the labor agreement is very much promoted and further developed by the new government in Mexico. It is basically their, or maybe I should say our, social agenda on labor that now, by making it part of an agreement, becomes an extra instrument for the government to make enforceability stronger with companies, okay? You have labor, you have environment, you have anti-corruption, an anti-corruption chapter. You have a chapter on small and medium enterprises of interest to the 3 countries, not just Mexico, certainly of great interest to Mexico, but the 3 countries everywhere. I mean, I can tell you, even in the United States, I don't have very recent statistics, but something like 8 years ago, the statistics that I had, and I don't have them with me, the number of companies that go into trade in any sector is amazingly small. Amazingly small. So you look at, I don't know, electrical, appliances or leather shoes, or any sector you wish, and you ask, okay, of the so many hundreds of thousands of companies the United States has listed in that kind of rubric, how many export at all? And the number is amazingly small. Depends on the sector. And I think it is very valuable to help small and medium enterprises to come into that area, which is beneficial to them and to the country and to everybody and to everything. So anyway, so I was saying labor, environment, anti-corruption, small and medium enterprises, and finally, culture, something that Canada had its own exception to protect culture, which they never use for reasons that I will not discuss. I can mention that in Q&A, you know about that. And since months ago, I told Bob Lighthizer, hey, this is of great interest to the new government in Mexico. If Canada doesn't get it, which was his resolute plan, then it's okay, we won't get it. But if Canada preserves the right to protect culture, that's needed by Mexico. And on the last day of the Canada-US negotiation, the previous Sunday, we were following through the day, are they agreeing or not? And at 8 p.m., I was talking to Bob Lighthizer to say, at 8 p.m. of the day that this had to be announced, and I said, Bob, I remind you, I need a cultural exception. And I'm fortunate that this was by telephone, because he sounded like biting my nose off. But we got it. We got it. We have a nice chapter that guarantees the importance of cultural diversity and so on, and allows for some measures to protect cultural diversity. So it's not to subsidize, Televisa, the biggest conglomerate competing with Univision and all that. No. But certainly if somebody is working in indigenous languages or something. So it has a rich social agenda. Let me just mention finally one item that attracted a lot of attention and where I was very pleased to put to work my very good relationship with Bob, whom I've known for 25 years, since I was honored to win a major dispute that Mexico leveled against its neighbor to the north because of dumping duties that were applied on Mexican cement exports to the modest amount of 60%. And with 60%, you are kicked out of the market. And it was a major dispute that we won. And on the other side, on the defense side, Bob Lighthizer was no longer deputy USTR. He never was deputy USTR to you. He was before. But he was retained as an advisor to the case. So he was there and so on. That's when we met. So I have a relationship of great respect and so on. And maybe this helped to deal with the sunset clause that the United States had proposed, which was to kill the treaty at 5 years unless all three governments agreed to continue. So it's a kind of a negative consensus required. And we always saw it, I always saw it as an easy way to deal with the problem of President Trump not being able to pull out. Because to pull out now, many people say you would need Congress approval. Maybe many people challenge that. It probably has to be tested, but that means that it's going to be a mess. If he tries to do that, being tested means going to the courts and so on. Whereas if you put in the agreement that under certain conditions you get out, then if those conditions are not met, you get out. So it seemed to us like the sunset clause was an easy way for the US to get out in 5 years. And he might change his mind, he might not. So this was an absolute deal breaker. And what we managed to change it into is a sunrise clause that is really mending a flaw that unwittingly the NAFTA had, which was no room for revision down the road. Okay? For example, since day one, the American authorities were unable to meet one commitment that we had in the NAFTA, which was, free trade on road merchandise transport. Okay, so the trucking people objected to it. It became an absolute political nightmare for our friends in the U.S. And we never had this open trade until, in a limited way, 4 years ago, after a dispute was won. Well, if we had had a review mechanism, this could have been discussed in 1997, or 3 years later. So the way the mechanism works is that the NAFTA, suppose that it is ratified now, from the date of the NAFTA, the new agreement, from the date of ratification, it lasts at least for 16 years. 16 is not a long time, but the main assurance that I have to the fact that the NAFTA is not going to be killed lightly or frivolously is the conditions and not the length of time. Namely, 16 years ahead. After 6 years, there's a review, what I called review with consequence, not just a review that you file away, but that leads to renegotiation of some particular clause or whatever. Okay? After that is completed, at 6 years, if the three countries are content and decide to continue, then you have 16 years ahead from that point of view, from point of time, with 6 years review later. So there you go, every 6 years having a review that opens up a 16-year horizon ahead, and the 16 falls to 10, and then 16, 10, 16 years of confidence for the business community. If at that point in time, in the 6-year review, one country decides not to continue, then we come into an emergency situation that was proposed by the US and that I love. So it really shows the honesty of my counterpart negotiators, because this was of great interest to us, but it made it for a better agreement. That's why Bob proposed it. So after 6 years, if one country says no, then you have a review 1 year later. And if then you have fixed whatever had to be fixed, and everybody agrees, then it's 16 years, 6 years. But if, again, you have a no, then you go into review 1 year later. And for the treaty to be killed, okay, it has to happen that that country or any country says no every year from year 6 to year 16, which, among other things, requires 2 successive presidents to have a similar outlook on trade, which has never happened, right? Things swing. Or in Mexico, the same. So it's a very nice review and cooperation, looking forward clause, as opposed to being a backdoor killer to the deal. And with that, sorry for speaking too long, probably. I'm open to questions, and I thank you very much.
Thank you, Jesus. Fascinating to hear your insights, and I love your description of free trade agreements. One statement that says free trade, then thousands of pages limiting that free trade. I have a number of questions of my own, but I know that time marches on, so are there people in our audience tonight who would like to pose a question? I have Laura here in front, gentleman there with his hand raised.
Hey, thank you. Laura Dawson, Canada Institute. Part of the small community that either reads books about trade negotiators or writes books about trade negotiators. And I just wanted to say off the top how extraordinary your legacy is going to be. You say you were waking up shaking and worried that your country was going to fall apart. But these negotiations were characterized by instability. The central power, the most important economy, seemed determined to blow up the negotiations. And people were looking for an excuse, and Mexico could have been that excuse. If there was fighting between the 2 regimes, between Peña Nieto and AMLO, or if AMLO hadn't said afterwards, I am willing to accept this deal and take the transition from one to the other, that imparted the stability to the process that allowed, I think, Canada and the US to finish the deal. So your first, weeks in the job, I think you created a historic legacy for your country and for your president. So thank you. I asked the Canadian negotiator, Steve Rahul, I said, what of the modernization elements in this negotiation are you particularly proud of? Steve, being kind of a low-spoken guy, says, well, I'm really proud that we don't have to fax certificates of origin to the border anymore, that we're using more modern elements to facilitate trade at the border. What are you proud of? You mentioned the 5 progressive agenda items, but is there something in there that you really think has been planted in this agreement that's going to pay dividends for North America?
Go ahead, Nancy. Jesus, and we'll take a second.
Sorry. Well, it's difficult to pinpoint it, but we really had a major revamping of all the dispute resolution provisions, particularly Chapter 20. Chapter 20 had another poison pill from the US side, turning the compulsory nature of final appellate decisions agreed wisely by Ambassador Hills and her counterparts, compulsory. Now the US was proposing to add a possible veto by the executive. You say, what's that? I mean, veto, that means that there's no dispute resolution. And that was agreed to be removed and so on. But apart from that, Chapter 20, which is the core of dispute resolution, is the state-to-state chapter. There were lots of things that were modernized, updated, clarified. So we really have a different kind of, I'm sure that the NAFTA's Chapter 20 was fine 24 years ago, but not now. And that's probably one area of major revamping that I find very important, very useful. That's probably my answer.
Thank you. Gentleman back here. Yeah. We've got two in the middle, and I've got two over here.
Based on your very...
Who are you? Sorry.
Rodrigo Garcia Verdu from the IMF.
IMF.
I want to ask you, based on your experience at the IMF in fiscal affairs, what would you recommend to your colleagues in the Ministry of Trade regarding this proposal to lower rates both for the VAT and for the corporate income tax in an area around the border, the northern border? Are you concerned about revenues going down, and what would be your advice to your colleagues?
You mean to create border areas with a special tax regime? I would be against. I don't think that's very healthy because of the distortions created in the economy, and also potential for revenue loss because you can always hop over to do your trades. So it's both things, distortionary and I don't think it'll be such a great way to create dynamism in that region. I know Mexico is doing it, but it's not my baby.
Some of you may have seen Jonathan Heath's comments to the Financial Times today about this. Yeah, his exact quote was, "It's kind of stupid." So, which is a little more blunt than you wanted to be, I think, Jesus.
Yeah.
We have Mary Beth and Dolly are there, so if we can get the microphone, and we'll take those two questions. I've got somebody at the back. Sorry, we already have a microphone at the back. I apologize, in the shadows back there.
Thank you.
Pepe, please.
I'm Jose with Reforma newspaper from Mexico.
With-
On chapter 23, there's an annex dealing with labor and Mexico required to pass secondary laws in Congress before the year 2019. Have you talked to your legislators, Morena in the Senate and in the House, about what are the chances of passing these labor secondary laws before January?
Yeah. You're talking about the commitments taken in the treaty.
Right.
Oh yeah, that's that chapter probably more than any in the treaty was extensively discussed with the then incoming legislature, which is now already in place. And the new Secretary of Labor is an amazingly competent young lady, and she went through the whole thing sentence by sentence and wanted to introduce 1 million changes. All of them to make it better, clearer, or more forceful. Amazing. But I kept saying, sorry, let's not open the whole thing. But it was extensively consulted, and anything of any kind of priority was taken up. And there are commitments to make legal changes now, which again are self-inflicted.
But I think he's referring to the collective bargaining commitment that Mexico has undertaken. So is it possible, do you think, to get that through the Mexican Congress by January 1st, 2019, which is what the agreement stipulates?
Yeah. No, that's very much foreseen and agreed to do it that way. It was always the intention to have that come into effect before the signature. I'm not sure why they ended up giving it that date of
January 1st.
January 1st, which is not change of government. That's December 1st, 1 month before. But it was agreed to be before even an earlier date. That's what had been agreed.
Thank you. Mary Beth.
Dr. Seade, Mary Beth Sheridan from the Washington Post. Thank you very much. I'm wondering, for Mexico, what will be the most tangible result of the changes with the
Tangible?
agreement?
You mean
Yes,
beneficial?
The most, for someone like me who's not a trade expert, what is the thing we're going to see, the changes with the new NAFTA? Which industries or which...
Well, changes can mean good or bad. And bad, there are some results that are going to be very costly and not necessarily efficiency creation, but these things are permanent disputes, particularly in intellectual property. There are two changes in intellectual property that will represent billions and billions in terms of gains for major producers, which are in America, and may represent opportunities for Mexico to push up the development of technology and so on. That's into the future. But right now, these are areas of clear commercial loss. One is that biological medicines in TPP were given the patent were given a life of 5 years plus 3 under certain conditions, 5 plus 3. And everybody expected this to be settled at 8, which is more than 5 plus 3, because it's already automatic. And no, it ended up being 10. And when I was discussing with some people in industry in Mexico, thinking, well, the difference between 8 and 9 is not huge. And I was told, yes, it is huge. There's billions of dollars for each point. So that's one. Another one is changes in the life of ordinary patents, and also the treatment of information generated in the production of patents, somewhat complicated changes. That then one net result is that what is the name? Unbranded medicines.
Generics.
Generic, exactly. Thank you. Generics become more difficult. In Mexico, generics are huge. So those are two things. There are other changes in intellectual property that I don't think are losses, are improvements to force us to put our act together. And one is, a commitment to have more stern disciplines against copying for commercial purpose audiovisual material, parrot stuff. And the other one, also harsher disciplines for signal theft, that you have a little cable that gives you your CNN for free. Those are not losses, but are adjustments. But the first two are, it's a zero sum. It's either you or me. And so those are some of the toughest. Another one is in textiles. In textiles, we have a very strong rule of origin negotiated from NAFTA 1, which says that if you want your shirt made in Mexico to be sold to the US as a Mexican shirt, the fabric has to be from Mexico, and the thread, the yarn, has to come from Mexico. So it's the whole thing. Okay, but then after some time, people say, hey, that means that we cannot produce ties because we have no silk in Mexico. So exceptions were created to allow for that. And those exceptions were tightened. So there are some areas of loss. Areas of benefit, again, I think the most obvious one is what I mentioned earlier on rules. I mean, let me start from labor. This is again self-inflicted, and it depends who you talk to in Mexico. If you talk to lots of firms, well, many of them will prefer to have a low level of protection for labor. And this is a big area of concern for López Obrador, to have free trade unions. Mexico has what we call cowboy trade unions, sindicatos charros, cowboy trade unions, which are basically bogus trade unions, very corrupt, traditionally in cahoots with the local authorities and things of that kind. And now all that is going out the window, and there are very strong disciplines here in the law, but also now in the trade law, and therefore in the enforcement for export and all that. That's a social gain area. I already mentioned culture and small and medium enterprises, but the big one, in my opinion, which, as I said, is not something I have seen mentioned by anybody, I think is in rules of origin. I think that if we put our act together, we can come well ahead in the car industry, for example. Because the car industry, big as it is in Mexico, it's very much like it's an assembly line. It's a maquila, very little value added. And you want to find the incentive, the excuse, the means to increase. Well, this gives it, because for them to benefit from free trade, they have to increase the regional content from 62.5 in cars to 75, which is huge. It means that the imported part falls from 37.5 to 25. So it's a whole third less, okay? Now, to do that, they can do different things. There's a provision that forces companies to bring production in part to the United States or Canada, because 40% has to be with high salaries, $16. But what people, stressing what I just said, may not know or may not have noticed, is that the high salary provision, 40% should be with $16 an hour salary. The high salary provision consists of the following. Of the 40% that has to be $16 an hour, up to 15, so 3/8 of the total, almost half, can be in engineering and design or management, 10 and 5% respectively. Well, engineering, skilled staff and engineering technical staff in the car industry in Mexico get salaries of between $10 and $22 an hour now, okay? And this is saying you have to have 16. So it means that with some encouragement, some support, not subsidy, but some support in development of science and things, Mexico can get the companies to develop all that in Mexico. Not only that means investment in production in Mexico, not north of the border, but probably even more importantly, more value added to begin to do more engineering and the like in Mexico. So to me, economically, the most important area of possible of opportunity is the car industry, rules of origin. And then socially, I would say labor, small and medium enterprises, and culture. Those three are very interesting for us.
Thank you very much. We've got time for, I'm going to take two more questions. Dolia, you have the microphone, I believe, right? And then I want to take a question over here at the back, if that's okay. Yes, please. And we're going to take these two questions together so that we can wrap things up.
Yes, I'm Dolia Esteves. I'm a freelance reporter.
Sorry, it's not working.
Just speak up a little bit, Dolia. Hold it a bit closer.
I'm Dolia Esteves, and I'm a freelance reporter from Mexico. And I have something very concrete. During all these weeks or months that you were here negotiating, did you ever had the opportunity to meet President Trump? And can you describe more or less or fill us in what López Obrador said last week, that it was not until Trump said, go ahead with whatever López Obrador wants on the energy sector, on the energy chapter, that things unlocked, and that the negotiators, American negotiators, accepted the reduction of a 25-page draft of the energy that you just described chapter into 2 or 3 paragraphs.
Jesus may want to save that for his memoirs because there's lots of memoirs about Trump now. But we're going to take the last question over here. Thank you.
Justin Margolis from the Quebec office. So thank you for recognizing culture, because for Quebec that was a very important stakeout. My question is actually as a young professional. While we don't have to send faxes to the border anymore, the most advanced technological degree in Chapter 16 is still the computer systems analyst. So I want to know how you feel about labor mobility not being touched, and if the administration.
So you're talking about the TN visas?
Yes, the TN visas, yeah.
Okay.
I was an observer, so these difficult issues to try to develop them, it was well beyond my reach. There are many things that were not done or attempted, and that's not something that changed. The number one item on the agenda for López Obrador, for the new government in the relationship with the U.S., is migration, generally. And there's every feeling that there's a lot of potential to do useful things. Every single major problem, or not every, but every single major problem the U.S. faces that relates to Mexico is the counterpart to a similar major problem that we face that relates to the U.S., okay? So crime in Mexico is drug consumption in the United States, and it is money produced in the United States that goes back to Mexico, and then the weapons crossing the border. So there's a lot of potential. And these are the issues that are to be discussed now, with migration right in the middle, already being discussed. There have already been several meetings and so on. So these were not issues that were dealt with. The first question, I missed the part on energy.
So I believe the question was, Dolia, that is it true that it was when President Trump said to his USTR that he should go with whatever Andrés Manuel wants on energy, that the door was unlocked and we could get to the end of the negotiation?
I'm not privy to that. I imagine that there was consultation. This was a deal breaker without the slightest doubt. So I'm sure that Bob Lighthizer went to the president several times a day, and I mean, he has said that the frequency of contact he has been having with the president, and probably that week was a peak. And this was a deal breaker. So I'm sure that President Trump took the decision, but at the same time, it was also a question of developing the required, ingenuity between Lighthizer and I to find a way to do it without without changing the substantive part. I mean, President López Obrador is not trying to change the balance of openness. I mean, the energy reform, just as I characterized trade deals the way I did, the energy reform is basically you had an energy sector that was perfectly closed, and you punched the hole there, and that's the legal energy reform. It's the little pin that went in. That's one reform, the legal reform. The executive reform is that the genie came out, and there was a lot of privatization. But you can equally, with the same hole, say, no, not a lot of privatization. So he doesn't intend to to plug the hole. He doesn't intend to disrespect the privatization has been done. I mean, not privatization, but the sales contracts that have been done. He's not going back. But he will have a more moderate rate of progress, and probably more importantly, reorientation of where he wants involvement by the international private sector. So, for example, he wants to develop refining. I expect, it's my personal hunch, that he will be more open to partnerships with Pemex, to reinforce Pemex that he wants, and to develop refining in Mexico, rather than exploration by the foreign companies. So to shift emphasis from area to area, but not to close anything. And then in terms of that week, I guess President Trump said, agree. It's not an act of generosity. You're negotiating, and this was a deal breaker for us. Trump, I had the opportunity to meet with President Trump. I found him amazingly impressive. He's a big man. He's, Duncan's height or my height, kind of.
We're delightful to be
with
compared.
a big volume, but not the volume of a kind of soft belly. No, not at all. A strong, cylindrical man. strong, very dashing, with his fantastic mane. So he seems to come out of something from the future, from outer space, and then a very self-confident attitude. So he's a very impressive. I found him a very impressive person. You cannot ignore him. He's a very engaging man by any standards. You have a good president, I think, at least to that extent.
I think, Jesus, that you have left us with plenty of food for thought and for conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a reception outside. There's some wine for us to share and hopefully to engage in more conversation with Jesus. Dr. Seade, thank you very much. We need to have you back at some point. It was very, very entertaining and highly informative. Thank you.
Thank you.